Okay, so today we're diving into something that I gotta say, used to seem like it was straight out of sci-fi.
Yeah.
But now it's like everywhere you turn on the news.
Huh.
Drone warfare.
Yeah.
We're going to try to unpack how we got to this point and what it all means for, the future of conflict.
Right.
And luckily, we've got expert speaker here to help us navigate this whole thing.
Happy to be here. And I think you're right. It's not some far off concept anymore.
Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting about this is how widespread it's become.
Yeah.
On a global scale.
It's not just the U.S. military anymore.
Right.
Our sources mentioned that, back in 2019, there were already a whole bunch of countries that were, in the business of making military drones.
Yeah.
We're talking the UK, Israel, China, Russia, Turkey, even Poland.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think most people probably still, when they hear drone strikes, they think U.S., right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think historically that's true. The U.S. has been a major player, especially in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Yemen.
Right.
And the data on those strikes, it paints a pretty stark picture when you start looking at the estimated casualties.
Okay, so let's get into those numbers.
Sure.
What are we talking about here? Thousands, tens of thousands?
So in Pakistan alone, estimates range from 2,000 to 3,500 militants killed in U.S. drone strikes.
Okay.
But what's really troubling is that civilian casualties are estimated to be anywhere from 158 to 965.
Wow, that is a huge range.
Exactly, and I think that kind of highlights one of the biggest controversies with drone warfare is this difficulty in getting accurate information,
right?
Lack of transparency, when it comes to civilian casualties. And then in Yemen, the numbers are similarly grim. You're talking estimated militant deaths between 846 and 1,758, and then civilian casualties somewhere between 116 and 225.
It's heavy stuff for sure. But, this brings up an important point, I think, for me, which is we're talking about, U.S. drone strikes.
Right.
It's not like they've been the only ones calling the shots, right?
Right.
In this whole arena. Our sources point to some interesting and let's just say it, shady dealings involving Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. Yeah. The situation in Yemen gets even more complicated when you factor in Saudi Arabia, right? They've been leading a coalition against the Houthi rebels there. And back in 2018, Al Jazeera dropped this bombshell report about a deal that the Saudis had allegedly struck with. Wait for it.
This is crazy.
Al-Qaeda in Yemen.
Hold on. So Saudi Arabia, a U.S. ally, is working with Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
You got to be kidding me.
No, and reportedly, the U.S. was aware of this deal.
Wow.
And even held back on drone strikes during that time. So you're talking about this really, really tangled web of alliances and conflicting interests, all playing out against the backdrop of this drone warfare technology that's rapidly becoming more and more accessible.
Yeah, it really is something out of a spy novel.
Right.
But with real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
And it makes you think about kind of the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
Which is, the U.S. might have been an early adopter, right? Mm-hmm. But it's pretty clear that other nations, even ones with, these kinds of questionable alliances, are getting into the drone game.
Right.
And then there's the tech itself, right? It's not, we're not just talking about those clunky predator drones anymore, are we?
Yeah.
Drone swarms.
Right.
That sounds straight out of some dystopian sci-fi film.
It does, doesn't it? But it's the reality now.
Right.
You're seeing everything from, those small commercially available quadcopters to sophisticated swarms of military-grade drones being deployed on the battlefield.
Right.
And it's not just about the hardware either.
Right.
It's the software, the tactics, everything is evolving just as rapidly.
And when it comes to adapting this technology, our sources point to ISIS as kind of a disturbing example.
Unfortunately, yes. ISIS really, really showed a real knack for taking existing drone technology, and often this was just readily available commercial drones.
Right.
And finding creative and deadly ways to use them.
Yeah, so give us an example, how were they using these things?
Well, during the battle for Mosul, they used swarms of small drones armed with explosives.
Wow.
To carry out these really, really effective attacks against Iraqi forces. Wow. They had, we're talking teenagers in some cases, who could control multiple drones at once.
Oh, wow.
And it completely overwhelmed, ground defenses, caused chaos, confusion, inflicted significant casualties.
It's almost like a video game, but with real lives at stake.
Yeah.
And that's what's so unsettling about all of this, right?
Yeah.
It's like this isn't some like theoretical threat anymore. It's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's evolving at this like alarming pace. I remember reading something about like the FBI being concerned about potential drone attacks on like U.S. soil, a few years back.
Yeah, you're right to be concerned. I mean, back in 2017, then FBI Director Christopher Wray actually testified before the Senate about this.
Wow.
And he said that, terrorist organizations were increasingly interested in using drones for attacks.
Right.
And he believed it was only a matter of time before we saw an attack like that happen in the U.S.
That's chilling. So we've gone from, nation states using these sophisticated military drones to terrorist groups using like off-the-shelf technology to carry out attacks.
Right.
It feels like this technology is becoming like democratized.
Yeah.
In this kind of terrifying way.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And I think the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war really drove that point home for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It was a real wake-up call on a global scale.
What happened in that conflict that was so significant?
Well, Azerbaijan used Turkish and Israeli-made drones, relatively inexpensive ones, compared to some of the really high-end, military hardware out there.
Right.
To devastating effect against Armenian forces.
Wow.
It really, shifted the balance of power in that conflict.
And wasn't Canada caught in the middle of that somehow?
They were, yeah. It came out that some of the Turkish drones that were used in the conflict were equipped with Canadian-made optics and targeting systems.
Oh, wow.
There was a big controversy,
Yeah.
and Canada ended up suspending its exports of that technology to Turkey.
Right.
Which, raises a whole other set of questions, right? About the responsibility of countries supplying this technology.
Right.
But I think the bigger takeaway from Nagorno-Karabakh was that, even smaller nations with relatively low budgets could use drones to achieve, significant military objectives.
It's a whole new world of warfare out there.
It is.
And it feels like the rules are being rewritten right before our eyes.
Yeah, and that's before we even get into the really scary stuff like artificial intelligence, autonomous drones.
Right.
And the potential for things to escalate even further out of control. But we'll save that for later.
Okay, so next up we're digging deeper into how drone warfare has played out in Ukraine. Spoiler alert, it's gotten even wilder than those, kind of grainy videos from the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict.
Right.
Get ready for AI, drone dogfights, and even, wait for it, cardboard drones.
You're not going to want to miss this.
All right, so we're talking Ukraine, which has tragically, become this testing ground for all kinds of drone warfare tactics.
Yeah.
And you can't talk about drones in Ukraine without mentioning the now famous Bayraktar TB2.
Right. They've practically become symbols of Ukrainian resistance, those Turkish-made drones.
Yeah, I mean, we've all seen those videos
right.
of Ukrainian forces using them to take out, Russian tanks, artillery positions, you name it. And it's kind of wild to think about how these relatively inexpensive drones have had such a big impact on the conflict.
It's been pretty remarkable. I mean, they've been incredibly effective.
Yeah.
And not just from a purely military standpoint.
Right.
The psychological impact of those videos, seeing these underdog drones taking on, Russian armor.
Yeah.
Has been huge for Ukrainian morale.
Right.
And for drumming up, international support.
Yeah, it's almost as if they become a bit of a propaganda tool, albeit, a very effective one.
Right.
But it's not like Russia's been sitting on the sidelines in this whole drone war either.
No, not at all. They've been using drones extensively too, though maybe not with the same like viral fame as the Bayraktar.
Right.
Remember those Iranian Shahed 136 drones we mentioned earlier?
Yes.
The so-called kamikaze drones?
Yeah, refresh my memory. Tell me about those again.
So those are basically loitering munitions, which means they can stay airborne for a long time. Like we're talking hours.
Right.
Just, circling around, waiting for a target to be identified. And then they basically just crash into them.
Wow.
Detonating, a pretty hefty explosive payload.
So not exactly precision-guided munitions,
Right.
but definitely effective in their own, terrifying way.
Yeah, they've caused a lot of damage, both to military targets and tragically to civilian infrastructure.
Right.
And then there's the whole drone on drone aspect of this conflict,
Wow.
which is just mind blowing to think about.
Yeah, like that first recorded drone-on-drone dogfight
Right.
back in October of 2022.
Yeah.
It feels like, again, something out of a movie.
It does, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's believed that a Ukrainian MiG-29 fighter jet
Okay.
engaged a Shahed 136, probably with its cannon,
Wow.
and managed to destroy it, but the explosion was so powerful that it took down the MiG-29 too.
Oh, wow.
Fortunately, the pilot survived,
Okay.
but it highlights, I think, that the chaotic, unpredictable nature
Right.
of this kind of warfare.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're rewriting the rules of air combat in real time.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier that Ukraine's been getting creative with its own kind of drone production.
Absolutely.
Right. So tell us about those.
Well, they've had to be resourceful given the circumstances, right?
Right.
So you've got Ukrainian companies now that are mass producing their own drones,
Okay.
like the Baba Yaga helicopter.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds like something out of Slavic folklore.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But this thing is very real. It can carry a 44-pound payload.
Wow.
Which is pretty significant.
Yeah.
And then there are the Sea Baby naval drones,
Okay.
which are essentially unmanned boats,
Right.
packed with explosive
Wow.
that have been used to attack the Russian Black Sea fleet. And then there was that almost unbelievable story
What's that?
about a Ukrainian unit that was using a drone made out of cardboard for reconnaissance.
You're kidding.
Yep, cardboard. They rigged it up with a GoPro camera and
Ah.
were using it to scout out Russian positions.
That's incredible. I mean, it just goes to show you how adaptable this technology is.
Yeah.
And how, even low-tech solutions can be, effective in the right circumstances.
Right, absolutely.
It's a crazy story, but it also highlights I think, a chilling point,
Mm-hmm.
which is that, this kind of technology is becoming more and more accessible all the time.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about, nation states with billion-dollar defense budgets anymore.
You hit the nail on the head.
Right.
And this has huge implications, I think, for the future of warfare.
Right.
I mean, take for instance what happened in 2023 with Hamas.
You're talking about when they use those commercial drones
right.
to attack those Israeli guard towers.
Right. They just use these off-the-shelf drones, the
Yeah.
kind you could buy, online or at a hobby shop.
Why?
To drop explosives before breaching the border wall.
Wow.
And then there were those really unsettling videos that surfaced online of Israeli troops and even a Merkava, the 4th tank,
Right.
being destroyed by these relatively simple drones.
It's a sobering thought. And then just this past April, we saw Iran carrying out what's being described as the largest drone attack in history.
Right.
Over 185 drones launched against targets across Israel.
Right. And this wasn't some random attack.
Right.
This was in retaliation for the bombing of an Iranian consular building in Damascus.
Right.
Just a few days earlier.
Right. So we're not just talking about tactical uses anymore, like reconnaissance or small scale attacks.
Right.
We're talking about strategic, coordinated drone warfare.
Yeah.
On a scale that was practically unthinkable just a few years ago.
Exactly. It's a whole new ballgame.
Right.
And it begs the question, what can be done to counter this?
Yeah.
How do you even begin to defend against these kinds of threats?
It's a good question, especially with this technology becoming so readily available.
Yeah.
So what are we doing?
Right.
What's the world doing to counter this new drone threat?
Well, there's a whole range of approaches being developed from the high tech to the surprisingly low tech.
Okay.
On the one hand, you've got electronic warfare systems designed to jam or hijack drone signals.
Right.
You've got directed energy weapons like lasers that can target and disable drones. And then, believe it or not, there are even trained eagles being used to snatch drones out of the sky.
Eagles. Seriously. That sounds like something out of like a medieval battle,
I know.
not modern warfare.
It sounds crazy, right? But
Okay.
but when you think about it, it makes a certain kind of sense.
Right.
You know, drones are relatively fragile,
Right.
and eagles are incredibly fast and agile predators.
Yeah.
Plus, it's a lot more environmentally friendly
Right.
than some of the other countermeasures out there.
Right. Right.
Right.
I guess when it comes to, countering a threat as adaptable as drones,
Yeah.
you've got to be creative.
You gotta think outside the box,
Right.
and the ingenuity doesn't stop there. I mean, there have even been reports of Ukrainians modifying like old biplanes
Yeah.
to go after drones.
Wow.
It's like we've come full circle from the early days of aerial combat
Right.
to this strange new world where we're fighting drones with eagles and biplanes.
It's mind-boggling when you really think about it.
It is.
But all of this really underscores a point you made earlier, which is this isn't some like abstract,
Yeah.
military thing.
Yeah.
It has real human costs.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's easy to get, I think, caught up in all the the tech and the tactical stuff.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's people's lives
Yeah.
that are at stake here.
You're absolutely right. I mean, behind every drone strike, every, casualty statistic, there's a human story.
Yeah.
And we can't lose sight of that,
Right.
especially as this technology becomes, even more powerful and,
Right.
and even more readily available.
Which brings us to what might be the most unsettling question of all, which is
Yeah.
what happens as this technology continues to spread?
Right.
What happens when anyone, not just
Right.
governments or militaries,
Yeah.
can get their hands on these incredibly powerful tools?
It's the question that keeps a lot of people up at night, I think,
Okay.
because on the one hand, you can see how this could be a real game changer
Right.
for smaller states,
Right.
or even non-state actors.
Yeah.
It could give them a way to kind of level the playing field
Well-
against, larger, more established military powers.
Like David and Goliath,
Right.
but with drones.
Exactly. But on the flip side,
Yeah.
there's a real risk that this kind of proliferation could actually lead to more conflict,
Right.
not less, right?
Right.
I mean, if the barrier to entry for waging war, or at
Right.
least, carrying out attacks, becomes lower,
Right.
it stands to reason that we might see more of it.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder if we're ready,
Right.
from kind of a global perspective
Yeah.
to deal with the ethical and the geopolitical challenges of this new drone age.
It's a huge challenge, and there are no easy answers, right?
Right.
I mean, the technology is evolving so quickly
Yeah.
that it's difficult for laws and regulations to keep up.
And then there's the whole issue of autonomous drones.
Yeah.
Which is, whole other can of worms that we could probably do a whole other deep dive on.
Right. The idea of machines making life or death decisions
Right.
on the battlefield is something that I think should give everyone pause.
Right.
It raises some really fundamental questions about accountability,
Right.
about the potential for unintended consequences,
Right.
about the very nature of warfare itself.
It's a lot to grapple with, for
Yeah.
sure. And honestly, it can feel a bit overwhelming at times.
Right.
So before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you,
Yeah.
For those of us who aren't military strategists
Yeah.
or tech experts,
Yeah.
what can we do? Like, how can we be more informed citizens in this rapidly changing world?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think the most important thing is simply to be aware.
Okay.
Educate yourself about this technology,
Right.
about its potential benefits, but also its very real risks.
Yeah.
Pay attention to how it's being used,
Right.
both by, governments and by non-state actors.
Mhm.
Ask tough questions.
Yeah.
Engage in thoughtful conversations about the ethical implications of this technology, because
Yeah.
this isn't just some abstract military thing. This is something that will impact all of us
Right.
in one way or another.
It's a shared responsibility then.
It is.
We can't just We can't just bury our heads in the sand
Right.
and hope it all goes away.
Exactly. We need to be, informed, engaged, and willing to have these difficult conversations
Yeah.
if we want to navigate this new era responsibly.
Well said. This has been an eye-opening deep dive,
Yeah.
to say the least. There's a lot to process, but I think we've covered a lot of ground here, from the early days of drone strikes to the emergence of drone swarms, AI, and even drone dogfights.
Absolutely.
It's clear that this technology is here to stay,
Yeah.
and it's up to all of us to grapple with its implications.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, expert speaker, thank you so much for lending your expertise
Okay.
to this incredibly complex and important topic.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk drones.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of drone warfare.
Yeah.
We'll keep digging into these issues as they develop, because one thing's for sure, this is a story that's far from over.
Right.
Until next time, keep learning,
Yeah.
keep questioning,
Absolutely.
and keep diving deep.